I'm very pleased to be back at the Modelica conference again. So I think this zonal model has been presented before in former Modelica conferences, I think in Munich and in Lund, for instance. And now with the Corona pandemic, we found, I think, a very valuable extension for this model, which I'm going to present today. So I want to speak just briefly about the background. I won't repeat everything about Corona because I think you've probably all heard enough of it. Generally, you have large droplets. They tend to fall down within short distance. So you use the mechanical barrier by masks or social distancing, like keep 1.5 meter distance between the people. And these droplets, I always figure them a bit like a tennis ball. If you beat it up, the wind can slightly change the trajectory, but only the net can catch this ball actually. And then there are the small droplets, which tend to spread out with the airflow, and they can sustain several hours. Of course, they can be filtered by masks. Cleaning devices can reduce or inactivate the virus on these droplets, and they behave a bit similar to tracer gas. And the image I always try to get these is more like a ping pong ball. So if you have the ball and the wind comes, then it will just fly away with the wind. And it's for these small droplets, we extended the zonal model or the viruses behind in the form of a tracer gas. Just a brief introduction on the principle of zonal modeling.
Yes? Excuse me, Victor. I think you have not shared your slides. I guess you have slides.
Okay, I will try to reshare it then. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we are.
Okay, yes.
They are there.
So briefly, well, we model more the small droplets that tend to fly with the air, similar to a tracer gas. Just to give you the background for the zonal modeling, the idea is to subdivide a room into zones or subvolumes. In the model, in the volume model, we have implemented mass conservation and conservation of enthalpy, and for instance, now of course conservation of species as well. And the flow model between two volumes calculates the mass flow rate from the pressure difference. And the advantage is that you get a moderate computational cost, but you still get a local resolution. So you see, for example, in a large environment, what the difference is whether an infected person is close to the door or somewhere in the middle of the room. We call this velocity propagating zonal model because the velocity is propagated into space. The flow model is ultimately based on the Bernoulli equation. However, Bernoulli involves a square root of delta P, which of course in Modelica is a bit unstable because at zero pressure difference, you get an infinite gradient. So this gets quite hard to solve. And I would say a trick we did in Modelica to be able to enhance the convergence is that we make the flow velocity between two zones as a state variable. And to make it as a state variable, we sum the forces that act on the flow path, which are pressure difference, momentum difference, elevation difference, and a viscous loss term, which more or less is a calibration factor of the model. And from these forces, we compute the acceleration. And of course, at steady state, this acceleration becomes zero. And if you then solve or set up the equation, you will find it's more or less the Bernoulli equation implemented plus a viscous loss term. So at steady state, we solve the Bernoulli equation. And for the transients, for Modelica to easier get there, we made the flow velocity a state variable. In the zones, as I said, we conserve the enthalpy, which means, of course, here we use the stream connectors. All mass flows that enter with their corresponding enthalpy plus the internal sources lead to a change of the internal energy in the zone, similar for the density. And of course, at steady state, the density change is zero, which equals to everything that flows in must flow out. And what we have added is this extra property of the zone, where this extra property is on one hand computed or transported by the mass flows between the zones, and there can be an internal production within the zone. And another thing which is done in the zone is this assignment of characteristic velocity so that the For example, if you have a blower that blows in air at a specific velocity, this is even further propagated into space and not dissipated within the first zone. So depending on how the airflows are, we assign such a characteristic velocity, which is propagated. So let's say the task in Modelica to extend an extra property is, well, rather straightforward with the current Modelica code. But of course, we wanted to verify whether our model is able to properly predict or where, for example, from an infected index patient, the spreading area will be. So from the early times of the corona pandemic, there is a well-documented outbreak in a restaurant in China, where actually they could trace back who was the first patient to be there and where were the infected people. And what this publication says is that all the infected people were on these 3 tables, and the index patient sort of was sitting in the middle of these 3 tables. Interestingly, not everybody was infected on these tables, so there seems to be some, I would say, individual probability whether you are vulnerable or not to the coronavirus. So you could, for example, have 2 people infected and 1 in between not infected in this publication. The publication even tells the airflow rate that 5 air conditioning units delivered 1 liter per second and per person. And we used this geometry, which was documented with the airflow rates, and made this zonal model of it. So you can see this subdivision into cubes here. And this index patient, he is modeled as a tracer source. And then to simulate the 2-hour exposure took roughly 1 minute on a normal laptop. So this is what I mean when I say it's much faster. The idea is, for example, comparing to CFD methods, where you have a really refined computational grid. They take much longer to simulate, whereas the zonal model is pretty quick to simulate. So the publication essentially said that all the infections were within these 3 tables. When we then look at the area of increased tracer gas concentration within this restaurant, we see that this red cloud roughly is at these 3 tables as well. So the main exposure is here. So from this, we got a good feeling that the zonal modeling actually is capable to detect the local distribution effect. And we were confident that we can use this modeling even for further parametric studies. Another application you can, of course, do with this tracer gas is if you do not put the index patient as a tracer gas source, but you put in each zone a tracer gas source, you will see that zones that are close to the air inlet will have a low concentration, and the more distance you get from the air inlet, the higher the concentration will be. And here you can, this is sort of an indicator for the age of air. So how old is the air in the local spots? So this simulation was done here on the left, where you can see here these blue areas are close to the air inlets. So here the air is pretty new. And then when you go more to the left here, the air is pretty old. And what you can see is when you compare it to this spread cloud of the index patient, is that the age of air is similar across this section of the restaurant. But here in this right area, there was no infected guest. And this is why we don't see the infections there, even though from a hygienical point of view, the air was equally good or bad. From which we even can conclude that the model is able to predict such an age of air. It is an indicator for the risk, but of course, just an indicator is not enough. You even need the location of the infected person to really predict where you would expect these infections to occur. What we, of course, even wanted to do is, and this is now, I would say, beyond the documented case, is a parametric study where we vary the inlet location and outlet positions in order to set up a ventilation system that would provide a better protection from an index patient. So we iteratively improve this by, honestly, manual changes in this case. So of course, we could do this because the model simulates pretty quickly. And what we see is if the same amount of supply air would have been supplied here at the ceiling level and extracted at the floor level, we would have a much lower H of air in the restaurant because the air is better distributed. And this increased tracer load, so this red cloud here, would be much more confined, which means I think it's not possible simply by ventilation to completely avoid that somebody, an infected person, will infect other people. But with the ventilation, you can confine this area to a smaller space. A second application, which I'm able to present now, which unfortunately is not in the paper because the report was not officialized by the time the paper was due, but now it is official on the webpage, so you can download it as well, is the assessment of COVID risk reduction strategies on the train. We did this for the German Eisenbahn-Bundesamt, so it's the German railway, what we call federal administration. And there we really used different activity levels of the people, of the infected guy who is in the train. For this, we use the so-called quanta, which is, I would say, some sort of artificial counting for virus emission, where by default, 1 quanta of inhaled virus corresponds to a 67% probability to get infected. Whether this is true for corona, and whether this is true for new mutations of corona, I think it's doubtable, but the concept can give you at least a source strength, and you can compare the relative concentrations along the space. What you find in literature is, for example, for breathing, you exhale 2.3 quanta per hour. For speaking, it's 11.4, and for loud speaking, it's 65.1 quanta per hour. So probably all of you are currently pretty low emissive. Thank you for that. And I'm somewhere here in the high area currently, but I'm alone in my office, so it should be okay. What we further integrated in the model is the emission reduction and the uptake reduction by using masks. So we investigated no mask, the surgery mask, and the FFP2 or N95 mask. And what we compared was the uptake from a passenger who sits nearby the infected person and one who is more distant from the infected person. So here you can, for example, see an example of a regional train coach. So you see here in this area where the seats are a bit more elevated, that is where the wheels are on the real train. Here is the door area, and here we put the infected passenger on this position. We investigated 2 ventilation configurations. So one configuration for heating, which more is the winter configuration. Here the rather warm air is blown at floor level and extracted at ceiling level. And the cooling, where air is supplied from the ceiling downwards, and the extraction as well as in the ceiling level here. We assumed a residence time of 1 hour because it's a regional train. And as I said, we evaluate this dose which is close by. So if the infected passenger is here, of course, well, if he's infected, he can't infect himself anymore. So we took the highest concentration close by and something more distant as to evaluate these 2 positions for our case study. When we look at the inhaled dose in milliquanta over the time, this one is shown for a speaking activity with a surgical mask. We see that close by, so the maximum dose when you sit close to the infected passenger is 5 milliquanta for this 1 hour, and more distant, it's around 2 milliquanta. This exposure far away from the passenger comes from the fact that there is a recirc system. And of course, this recirc system tends to, well, in the end, take the air and distribute it all along the coach. The second case we investigated is what happens if we have an 80% effective filtration in the research system. So we remove most of the viruses. And you can see that both for the close by and the more distant exposure, it's beneficial. In cooling mode, you get quite similar result as for the heating mode. The only thing is the reset rate is higher, which leads to a slightly higher spread along the coach. And there is even a free cooling mode. So we got these data from the producer of the coach, where you ventilate the whole train with fresh air. So it's typically in spring and fall, you can do that when the air is sufficiently cold outside, but then you operate at lower flow rates. And this a bit lower flow rate leads to a higher exposure close by to the passenger. But of course, because you have close to no recirc, it's close to negligible far away from the passenger. These are technical measures you can take to improve the situation. Of course, it's interesting even to investigate what are your behavioral influences that you could do to protect yourself and others. So we even investigated for the same heating case. So this is the baseline case with the surgical mask and the speaking activity. What happens when you wear a mask? So if nobody wears mask, you can see you more or less can add a factor of 3 to the exposure. If everybody wears the FFP2 masks, you both reduce the emission, but you even reduce your uptake. You see that you have close to no exposure, neither far away or nearby. We even looked at the speaking activity. So if this infected person speaks loudly, the emission is, well, I would say close to an order of magnitude higher. If he just is breathing, so he's silent, it is much lower. And what I think, if you compare these 3 diagrams, is that the personal behavior that the passengers on the train have has a similar or even higher effect to reduce the exposure than technical solutions. So for example, if you imagine you would combine the FFP2 mask with only a breathing activity, you would be below the filtration case, which is, even if you would say 100% filtration, you would still have some local exposures. So
you need to, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, I'm concluding now. So yes.
Oh, okay, great.
So to conclude, we are able with this model to assess the local ventilation and the placement situation. We have shorter computational times compared to CFP. It enables parametric studies. We have verified the model for a documented super spreading event. And for these train simulations, we've done many more of them. I provide here the link. It's a report that can be downloaded. So thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, looking forward to my successors in this session.